At dawn on March 23 in 1943, a low desert light wetted the scrub of the Guettar Valley. From the American forward positions, the horizon was a hard line of wind and rock. Then, over a distant ridge, dark silhouettes appeared, armor, dozens of tanks rolling in formation, veteran crews who had fought in Libya and Tunisia, and who expected to take the valley with shock and speed. For a moment, the scene is almost cinematic. Steel hulls glinting, radio antennas twitching, commanders in German-grade jackets squinting against the sun. The Americans in the line do not see mythic invincibility. They see the problem every commander fears, an enemy armored spearhead, experienced and coordinated, advancing on ground that will decide the day. 27 days earlier, another valley had been the scene of a starker lesson. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, U.S. formations had been shoved back, command cohesion had fractured, and confidence in American combat effectiveness was shaken. Men who had trained in the United States, shipped across oceans and deserts, were now learning the cost of organizational errors in sight of the enemy. The humiliation was not merely tactical, it was systemic. Radios did not talk to one another. Divisions were committed in piecemeal. Artillery rarely concentrated in time on a single objective. Tank crews found themselves in hulls whose high profiles made them easy targets. And at headquarters, commanders who could not see the tactical picture were making decisions as if on a different battlefield. This is not a story about American soldiers failing. It is a story about how an army that started the Tunisia campaign with the same institutional handicaps as other armies, patchy doctrine, inexperienced commanders, and rigid habits, managed, within weeks, to transform those weaknesses into coordinated strength. The question the title poses is blunt. Why did American forces adapt faster than any other Allied army in that theater? The short answer is not a single miracle. It is a web of institutional learning, theater-level authority, leadership that enforced standards, procedural fixes to the way artillery and armor were employed, and an industrial base that turned ideas into new equipment and radios rapidly enough for doctrine to matter on the battlefield. The longer answer begins at Kasserine. Kasserine Pass was not a single blunder so much as a catalog of things that went wrong together. German forces under experienced commanders exploited the seams that existed between U.S. units and between the ground and the staff that claims to run them. Communications were fragmented. Radio sets were limited in number, on incompatible frequencies, or withheld from forward units. Units reported fires and sightings up channels that did not result in massed response. The idea that artillery could be rapidly concentrated on a single target, what the Americans would come to call massed fires, was more theory than habit. Kasserine Pass was not a single blunder so much as a catalog of things that went wrong together. German forces under experienced commanders exploited the seams that existed between U.S. units and between the ground and the staff that claimed to run them. Communications were fragmented. Radio sets were limited in number, on incompatible frequencies, or withheld from forward units. Units reported fires and sightings up channels that did not result in massed response. The idea that artillery could be rapidly concentrated on a single target, what the Americans would come to call massed fires, was more theory than habit. Artillery coordination requires several moving parts: observers forward who can see the target, reliable radio nets to transmit grid coordinates, and a fire direction center that can take incoming calls, calculate ballistic solutions, and order batteries to open together. Many U.S. formations at Kasserine lacked elements of that chain. Armor doctrine was another core problem. Tanks came in different types with different intended uses. The M3 Lee/Grant had a high silhouette and mixed armament that in certain tactical settings was a liability. It was a design born of compromises, and battlefield reality had exposed those compromises. Tank crews had been tempted to operate tanks as independent duelers rather than as support arms integrated with infantry and artillery. The new concept of tank destroyer battalions, units designed specifically to counter enemy armor with speed and concentrated anti-tank fire, had not yet been properly drilled in employment. Tank destroyers were often parceled out in small groups to support infantry, rather than massed to meet a concentrated armored attack where their firepower and speed could be decisive. Command culture added fuel to the fire. Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2nd Corps at the time, famously located his headquarters far from the front in a concrete bunker near Tebessa. Distance crystallized inattention. Officers at the point of contact felt isolated. Decisions made at ground level, where situational awareness mattered most, were not always empowered. This was not merely a personality flaw, though personalities mattered, but an institutional gap between the theory of command and the lived reality of chaotic ground combat. The human cost was immediate and grim. Soldiers fighting in forward trenches and shallow foxholes felt abandoned to mechanized attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. Units chopped into smaller groups and committed to the line as reinforcements with little coordination, what veterans call being thrown into the meat grinder. Reports from the field would use blunt language. After-action summaries described confusion at command posts, radios that were silent when needed, and artillery that, more often than not, could not be brought to bear in the time and manner required. The reaction at higher levels was swift and, crucially, decisive. Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as theater commander, was not content to let defeat be explained away as the inevitable fog of war. The theater commander's authority mattered because it allowed changes to be made in the chain of command and in doctrine without waiting for pieces to warp in administrative time. Fredendall was relieved of command. George S. Patton was summoned and, over the coming weeks, would provide the kind of on-the-ground energy and discipline that television and film images later distilled into legend. Patton's role was not the only factor, but his style, rapid movement, visible standards, relentless pressure for physical and tactical competency forced units to adapt their habits, not merely their paperwork. This is a good point to define the specific terms at play. A Fire Direction Center, FDC, is the nerve center of an artillery battalion. It receives reports from forward observers, computes firing data, angles, charges, fuse settings, and then assigns those firing commands to the batteries. Massed fires refers to the coordinated firing of multiple artillery batteries on a single target area to create overwhelming effects, destruction, suppression, or area denial. A forward observer is a soldier with a radio and binoculars, or a rangefinder, posted close to enemy lines to identify targets and call in artillery. A tank destroyer battalion, in American doctrine of 1942-43, was a mobile anti-tank unit, equipped with vehicles mounting guns designed to defeat enemy armor. It was supposed to be employed in concentrated units to counter armored breakthroughs. These are not arcane phrases. They describe the nuts and bolts plumbing of modern mechanized combat. The reforms after Kasserine were both blunt and granular. At the leadership level, Eisenhower's intervention made clear that theater-level decisions would no longer be an abstract layer of dispatches and reports. Commanders needed to be where they could understand what was actually happening. That meant more forward headquarters, commanders who inspected lines, and a culture that punished sloth and rewarded initiative. Patton's insistence on standards, clean equipment, visible discipline, rehearsed procedures was part psychological, part tactical. A corps with tightened discipline is an organization more likely to execute complex, time-sensitive tasks like coordinated artillery barrages or rapid repositioning of anti-tank units. Doctrinally, artillery coordination was overhauled. The United States Army began to institutionalize the concept of the FDC as a tactical necessity in every division and corps. Radios and frequencies were standardized and, importantly, drilled. Units practiced formats for call-for-fire messages, the observer's grid reference, target description, method of engagement, and timing. These were made routine. That routine is deceptively powerful. When a forward observer can, in seconds, transmit a standard call for fire that a trained FDC can instantly process, the delay between identification and response shrinks from minutes to tens of seconds. Massed artillery, when correctly employed, can stop or blunt armored thrusts before the enemy closes to point-blank ranges. Armor doctrine saw its own corrections. American armored units began to emphasize combined arms action, tanks supporting infantry, infantry securing anti-tank threats, and artillery suppressing enemy gun positions. Tank destroyer battalions, rather than being parceled out in small detachments, were held at higher echelons and deployed where enemy armor presented the greatest concentration. That doctrinal pivot, holding anti-armor resources centrally and using them decisively, meant that when German tanks did appear in force, they faced not scattered opposition, but organized, coordinated anti-tank fire. A crucial and less glamorous reform concerned communications. Radios were not simply hardware, they were protocols. The U.S. Army moved to ensure that radios were distributed to critical forward elements, forward observers, company commanders, tank platoon leaders, and that shared frequencies were used for joint operations between infantry, armor, and artillery. Liaison officers from the air forces were embedded with ground units to coordinate close air support, and conversely, ground officers were tasked to direct artillery strikes with more precision. These liaison links reduced the instances in which air and ground forces acted at cross purposes or failed to exploit fleeting opportunities. Training and rehearsal translated doctrine into muscle memory. Units that practiced call-for-fire procedures, combined arms movements, and defensive minefield layouts before enemy contact performed very differently from units that tried to learn on the line. Repetition exposed problems in equipment, faulty radios, inadequate ammunition supply, or in procedures that otherwise would only show up under fire. Training also changed the psychological atmosphere. Soldiers who had rehearsed a response to a sudden armored attack were less likely to panic, more likely to execute a coordinated defense, and therefore more likely to survive. Behind these doctrinal and procedural changes was a strategic enabler that is often overlooked in the heat of battlefield narrative: industrial capacity. American industry was not just producing tanks and guns in volume, it was producing new variants, radios, and replacement parts that allowed units in theater to attempt doctrinal innovations without being constrained by scarcity. An idea that required additional radio sets or a handful of M10 tank destroyers could be tested because those items could be shipped. Having the means to equip doctrine is as important as developing doctrine itself. The United States could pilot concentrated tank destroyer deployments because equipment and replacements were available at a scale that made risk more tolerable. There is a tension here worth emphasizing. Adaptation requires both permission and capacity. Permission comes from authority, the theater commander who can reassign leaders and reorder priorities. Capacity comes from the industrial and logistical base that turns a concept into hardware in the field. Without Eisenhower's willingness to remove commanders and push change, the best ideas would have remained memos. Without production and shipping, the changes would have been empty gestures. Change in wartime rarely happens only on paper. It shows up on the ground in how units prepare their lines, and in what soldiers see at first light. In the weeks after Kasserine, American units would begin to dig deeper, not merely to hide, but to create tactical depth. Shallow foxholes were replaced by emplacements and anti-tank obstacles. Minefields, simple yet effective, were emplaced to channel enemy armor into kill zones. Forward observers were placed where they could see the approaches and call in massed fire quickly. These are concrete, physical alterations to the battlefield that reflect doctrinal change. They are also, in the uncomfortable calculus of combat, effective because they force the attacker into predictable spaces. Small but telling changes in everyday military life also mattered. Commanders were expected to patrol nearer to the line, to inspect defensive works, and to account for unit readiness. Servicing schedules for radios became enforceable orders. Patton famously emphasized appearance and readiness. Clean uniforms, maintained vehicles, not merely as vanity, but as a way to instill an attention to detail that translated into battlefield effectiveness. That attention to small things is not the whole story, but it is part of the culture that allowed more complex coordination to follow. Between the hard lessons and the reforms, there were skeptics. Institutional inertia exists in every army. Officers trained in previous wars or who had found ways to succeed within older doctrines were not instantly convinced that massed artillery or centralized anti-tank reserves were superior. But the urgency after Kasserine diminished resistance. The theater was not operating in a laboratory where the time for doctrinal debate was measured in months. The calendar of war compressed decisions into weeks and days. The combination of a glaring failure, visible changes in the chain of command, and the availability of equipment created a narrow window in which reforms could be implemented and tested rapidly. It is important to place this in comparative perspective without declaiming that one army was wholly better. The British, fighting in different sectors and with different operational histories and supply lines, had their own adaptation tempo and institutional constraints. The Soviets, on the Eastern Front, learned rapidly through brutal attrition. The Germans, long the standard-bearers of mechanized warfare, also adapted. But by 1943, their own resource constraints and strategic overreach began to limit the speed at which they could respond to new enemy tactics. The claim that American forces adapted faster than any other Allied army needs those qualifiers: theater-specific authority, industrial capacity, and a set of reforms that were implemented in a compressed time frame. If the reforms after Kasserine were the blueprint, Guettar would be the field test. The American defensive lines there were not accidental. They were consciously constructed to translate doctrine into battlefield effects. Minefields were laid to deny enemy armor straightforward avenues of approach, and to break up formations so that massed anti-tank fire could be decisive. Forward observers and reconnaissance patrols were placed to detect enemy movement at the edge of hills and along valleys. Artillery units were arranged so that the FDCs could combine fires from multiple batteries rapidly, creating overlapping zones of fire that could be called in on short notice. On the morning the panzers rolled into view at Guettar, American observers had already rehearsed what to do. The call for fire sequence, observer reports grid, description, request for suppression or destruction, was not a novel improvisation but a practiced routine. When that first tank hit a mine and stalled, it was not merely bad luck for the Germans. It was the product of planning intended to impose friction on their advance. Friction, the term armies use for the inevitable difficulties that make elegant plans messy, was being manufactured intentionally. Massed artillery followed. When multiple batteries fired on a single target in coordinated bursts, the effect was not only physical destruction, but psychological dislocation. Tanks and crews that expected to roll into a valley found themselves under a coordinated hammer that struck with accuracy and volume. In that moment, doctrinal correctness became deadly practical. Combined arms, massed fires, mines, and concentrated anti-tank weapons produced results where ad hoc responses at Kasserine had failed. The contrast between the two moments, Kasserine's chaotic retreats and Guettar's prepared interlocking defense, is the central drama of this narrative. It shows how, within weeks, corrections to leadership, procedures, communications, and equipment use could change the tactical calculus. But the story is not yet finished. A theater can make changes and score local successes. The question that follows is whether those changes will stick, whether they will be codified into doctrine and training, and whether they will inform larger operations in Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy. Before we reach that wider picture, it is necessary to examine the specifics that made the difference on the ground. The first specific is the mathematics of artillery. Artillery's destructive power is a function of weight of fire, the total amount of explosives that can be projected onto a target per unit time, and accuracy. The United States had the guns and the ammunition to produce weight of fire when batteries were pooled and directed by a competent FDC. Many commanders in North Africa had previously feared centralizing artillery because of concerns over availability at the last moment. After Kasserine, those concerns shifted toward the necessity of concentration. Centralized artillery control meant that when a threat appeared, multiple batteries could be tasked in minutes rather than one battery sputtering alone. Second is the employment of tank destroyer battalions. The doctrinal concept required that these mobile anti-tank units be massed and committed decisively where enemy armor formed. In practice, this meant holding battalions at division or corps level and committing them en masse into prepared kill zones. When the Germans found themselves channeled by minefields and then subjected to withering anti-tank fire from pre-sighted emplacements, the effects compounded. The tank destroyer's advantage, speed and concentrated gunpowder, was greatest when used against a concentrated armored thrust, not when parceled out in small teams. Third is air-ground coordination. Close air support is not as simple as airplanes drop bombs. It requires liaison officers, forward air controllers, and shared procedures for identification and timing. Embedding air liaisons with ground formations reduced the chances that aircraft would strike where friendly troops were exposed, and it increased the likelihood that fleeting opportunities, an exposed flank, a halted column, could be exploited before the enemy regrouped. Fourth is training and rehearsal. Units that had rehearsed minefield defense, anti-tank employment, and call for fire sequences practiced those actions under simulated stress. Repetition does more than teach skills, it breeds confidence and reduces the time lost to hesitation. In a sudden attack, hesitation is often lethal. Fifth and subtle is leadership presence. Commanders who patrol forward and visibly accept the risk of proximity communicate commitment. Soldiers who see that their commanders share danger are likelier to trust orders and execute complex operations. Patton's rigorous inspections and public enforcement of standards did not create tactical fixes by themselves, but they made enforcement of new procedures possible at a time when old habits might have otherwise prevailed. These 5 elements, massed artillery, concentrated tank destroyer employment, improved air-ground liaison, drilled procedures, and leadership presence, are the practical pillars that turned concepts into combat performance. They were not invented in a vacuum. Lessons had been discussed in U.S. doctrinal circles before Tunisia. What changed in early 1943 was the speed and decisiveness with which those doctrinal discussions were translated into practice under the pressure of real combat and with the support of theater authority and industrial supply. Yet reform always encounters friction, even among allies. The British had their own ways of fighting and command structures forged by years of desert warfare. Interoperability required negotiation. It is important not to frame the American changes as an imperial blueprint imposed on allies. In Tunisia, British and American forces learned to coordinate, sometimes awkwardly and sometimes with great success. The British contribution to local operations, intelligence, and artillery expertise remained important. The American claim to rapid adaptation is not a claim of unilateral superiority, so much as a recognition that in that theater and at that time, the United States combined several favorable elements: authority, resources, and willingness to rework procedures that produced a distinct tempo of change. The preparatory work at Guettar was steeped in that practical, procedural rigor. Observers were positioned, minefields were sighted to channel armor. Artillery plans included pre-registered fields of fire, areas that had been surveyed and intentional sight lines established so that guns could open fire accurately with fewer correction rounds. Pre-registered fire matters because it compresses response time. Instead of taking 2 or 3 ranging shots to bracket a target, a battery can call a known registration and begin with effective fire almost immediately. Tactical overlays, the maps that planners and junior officers carried, reflected these pre-registrations. Soldiers were briefed not only on their immediate tasks, but on the expected timing of artillery lifts, the location of anti-tank obstacles, and the rally points if a position was overrun. That level of granular planning translated into the disciplined execution observers would later report under fire. And yet, even at the moment when all the preparatory pieces are in place, uncertainty remains. The opening silhouettes on the horizon, those 50 tanks, are still an unknown variable. Did the enemy reconnoiter the minefields? Were their crews instructed to probe with infantry support? Will German artillery suppress the American FDCs first? The drama of El Guettar is precisely this collision between careful preparation and the indeterminate variables of combat. It is here where procedure meets actuality that adaptation is tested. The morning attack begins not with a theatrical charge, but with small, incremental failures. An armored vehicle runs onto a mine that had been placed in a draw. A radio crackles as an observer transmits a call for fire. A battery answers with a thudding response that reverberates across the valley. In this phase, the FDCs prove their worth. They take an observer's hurried coordinates, calculate separate aiming points for multiple batteries, and bring down a sequence of rounds intended to stop the advance. That sequence, observer call, FDC computation, battery response, is the mechanical heartbeat of modern indirect fire. When the system works, it amplifies the defensive posture. When it fails, the consequences are immediate. What happens in those first compressed minutes of contact is both the proof of the reforms and the crucible that will determine whether they are institutionalized beyond a single battle. If the coordinated defense holds, doctrine gains a new legitimization. Not merely a set of words in a manual, but an empirically validated way of fighting. If it fails, the army will be back to square one, forced to learn again under the erosive pressure of casualty and retreat. At El Guettar, the tests are severe, and the American dispositions face their first answers. But the story of adaptation does not resolve in a single morning. It plays out in the interaction between tactical successes and the broader efforts to codify lessons across command echelons. The better the after-action analysis, honest, rigorous, and unafraid to attribute failure to systems rather than individual cowardice, the better the chance that the reforms will survive beyond the battlefield. These analyses feed training, they inform doctrine writers, and they influence procurement priorities. This is a crucial point where organizational culture determines outcomes. An institution that blames soldiers for systemic failures will not fix the root causes. An institution that sees failure as a diagnostic tool will create procedures to prevent future recurrence. American responses after Kasserine moved in the diagnostic direction. After-action reports were blunt, commanders were replaced, practices were revised and rehearsed. The result was not instant mastery, but rapid, testable improvement. The imminent clash at El Guettar is therefore more than a tactical confrontation. It is an experiment in organizational learning under fire. Variables are controlled by design: minefields, pre-registered artillery, centralized tank destroyer reserves, and then exposed to the unpredictability of battle. The stakes are not merely the valley itself. They are whether an army can convert painful lessons into repeatable tactics and, eventually, into doctrine that will shape operations in Sicily, Italy, and beyond. There is also a human story threaded through these institutional changes. Commanders like Patton and Eisenhower occupied different moral and operational spaces. Eisenhower's authority and willingness to take responsibility for theater-level changes made reform possible. Patton's personal energy and insistence on standards imposed a discipline that filtered down to unit behavior. But the operational success depended on countless lower-level actions: a forward observer making a timely call, an artillery crew maintaining its firing tables in the mud, a radio operator switching frequencies under stress. The psychology of adaptation, confidence born of rehearsal, and the visible presence of leadership matters as much as doctrine. Men and women who believe in their procedures execute them under pressure. Belief is not mystical. It is procedural assurance reinforced by training and leadership. As the German tanks edge into view that morning, the readers of history sometimes want a single dramatic climax, one dramatic barrage, one heroic counterattack. In reality, the action will be multifaceted. Mines that break the coherence of formations, artillery that punishes exposed elements, tank destroyers that exploit choke points, and infantry that secures flanks. The American defense at El Guettar, when it unfolds, will not be the product of a single innovation, but the layered effect of multiple small advantages leveraged coherently. Before the valley explodes into conflict, it is worth reflecting on the comparative dimension that the title demands. Other Allied armies learned under pressure in different ways and for different reasons. The British had long experience in desert warfare and brought institutional knowledge accordingly. But they were also constrained by supply lines and imperial commitments that shaped priorities. The Soviets adapted rapidly under catastrophic pressure and enormous sacrifice. But their methods were often costly and not always transferable. What set the American experience in Tunisia apart was the velocity at which theater authority, doctrinal correction, and material sufficiency coalesced to produce operational improvement. That velocity, short, sharp, and decisive, explains why, in this particular theater and time, American forces adapted more rapidly than many of their counterparts. But the claim needs precision. Adaptation was fastest in the specific operational context where the U.S. could rapidly reassign leadership, centralize resources, and ship the material needed to test doctrinal changes. As the sun edges higher over El Guettar, the prepared defenses stand in stark contrast to the ad hoc responses of Kasserine. The artillery forward observers are in place. The mines have been sighted. Anti-tank reserves are held ready. The FDCs are manned and their radio nets are alive. The theater that had tasted humiliation weeks before now waits to see if its corrections will hold under the immediate heat of combat. For commanders and soldiers alike, the moment is a test of whether institutional learning can be made practical, and whether an army can turn doctrine into survival. When the first mine detonates and a tank grinds to a halt, the valley holds its breath. The subsequent seconds, observer call, fire missions, round striking, will determine not just a tactical outcome, but the credibility of an entire set of reforms. If the American defenses cohere, that success will ripple outward. Commanding echelons will take the validated tactics into training. Procurement will prioritize what works, and doctrine writers will fold the lessons into manuals that shape future decisions. If the defense fails, the army will be forced to revisit assumptions under the pressure of fresh casualties. Either way, the morning at El Guettar is more than a battle. It is a diagnosis. It will show whether the United States Army's rapid changes after Kasserine were real improvements or fragile improvisations. It will test the hypothesis that truth on the battlefield can be distilled into practical procedures, and that those procedures can be taught, equipped, and executed reliably under fire. The rest of the story, how the battle unfolds, how the Germans react, and how the results of El Guettar feed back into larger strategic decisions in Tunisia and beyond, will determine the degree to which the American army institutionalized its lessons. But at this precise dawn, with silhouettes climbing the ridge and the first detonations already echoing, adaptation is not an abstract claim. It is a practical experiment about to be judged by fire. The mine detonates like a verdict. The hull of the German tank pitches, a column shudders, and dust blooms along the draw. For an instant, the valley is a tableau of small disasters. Treads thrown askew, crews scrambling, metal ringing under shrapnel. The forward observer sees the disruption and does exactly what he has practiced, calls the grid, describes the target, requests suppression. The voice on the radio is clipped but steady. The fire direction center, manned, practiced, expectant, takes the coordinates, crunches the angles, and dispatches orders to batteries already on the watch. Within seconds, multiple gun tubes lift and begin to speak in quick succession. The valley answers with a thunder not of a single gun, but of many. That thunder is not merely noise, it is an operational phenomenon. Weight of fire applied where weight of armor had expected to have its way. In accounts filed after the fight, artillery observers measured the opening barrage as sustained and accurate enough to break the cohesion of the first armored wave. Some after-action summaries speak of a roughly 12-minute sequence of concentrated fire that disintegrated the initial German attack. Other documents are less precise about the duration, but unanimous about the effect. The German advance lost momentum. That qualification matters. The exact timing varies between sources, but the pattern is clear. Where at Kasserine a single battery sputtered alone, at Guettar multiple batteries answered a single cue, and the result was cumulative and decisive. A tank destroyer battalion that had been held in reserve now slides into position, a deliberate move rather than a panicked dispatch. The doctrine that had been argued over in staff rooms and practiced in the scrub now shows its purpose. Anti-tank guns and M10 tank destroyers, reports indicate several M10s were present, older M3-type gun motors were also in the theater and may have been used where available, take advantage of the channeling effect created by minefields. The mines have done their work. They burst, they halt, they funnel. The defenders have not merely prepared obstacles, they have prepared options, places where enemy tanks will be forced into narrower arcs, places where concentrated guns can see and engage effectively. From the American perspective, these are not improvisations, they are rehearsed sequences. Forward observers wear the same shorthand. Gunnery tables are current. Signal protocols mean that a call for fire produces not a debate but a process. The result is a multiplication of defensive power. Artillery suppresses, mines immobilize, tank destroyers deliver localized loss of armor, and infantry holding the flanks deny infantry support to the armor. Every element supports the others. It is the textbook definition of combined arms executed under pressure. German crews react the way crews must when a plan meets unexpected friction. Some attempt to press forward and are shredded. Some try to wheel for flank approaches. Some back away to regroup. German commanders, experienced and adaptable themselves, test the American defenses with probes, trying to find gaps. Where they find none, the initial attack dissolves into a series of smaller, disjointed efforts. Air support for the Germans, when it appears, is limited and often too late to restore momentum. The combat is brutal and granular. It is not the sweeping, idealized armored charge of some histories, but rather a sequence of shocks and countershocks, a chessboard in which the Americans have placed a disproportionate number of effective pieces. By mid-morning, after the first major effort has been repulsed, the Americans consolidate. They move wounded back, reform lines, and the FDCs remain alert for the next call. On multiple factors, the minefields, the pre-registered artillery, the centralized anti-tank reserves, and the drilled communications, American commanders now rely. The Germans, having tasted the cost of a direct, concentrated thrust in that sector, attempt a later attack that afternoon with altered dispositions. It too meets stiff resistance. The pattern repeats. Mines slow and break formations. Massed artillery punishes exposed elements, and tank destroyers exploit choke points. Over the course of the day, the cumulative effect is clear in the tactical reports. What the Americans had converted into a system of defense yields results where ad hoc measures had failed weeks before. What Guettar demonstrates, and what the theater leadership demands afterward, is not just that a single defensive plan can work, but that institutional practices can be converted into repeatable methods. The difference between a good idea and a working doctrine is practice under stress. Guettar becomes a practical validation for the reforms advocated after Kasserine. When radios, FDCs, and massed anti-tank reserves become routine, the margin of tactical error shrinks. Back at Corps and theater headquarters, the equipment of adaptation, reports, maps, and photographs begin to accumulate. After-action reports from Guettar, which, a scholar's note, vary in detail and emphasis, are remarkably candid about what functioned and why. Officers on the spot praise the speed of artillery response. Staff officers note that centralized anti-tank reserves were decisive when committed properly. Signal officers report that standardized frequencies and disciplined radio procedure reduced dangerous confusion. Importantly, these reports do not indulge in heroic myth-making. They attribute success to systems and to practice. The forward observer who was where he should be, the FDC that had current tables, the commanders who insisted on keeping reserves centralized rather than parceling them out. Institutionalization, the hard work of turning a battlefield validation into doctrine that survives personnel turnover, begins in earnest. Field manuals and training circulars are updated to reflect the priority of massed fires and centralized anti-tank employment. Infantry divisions receive clear guidance about integrating with tank destroyer battalions and methods for embedding forward air controllers. Training centers, stateside and in theater, run exercises focused on the coordination that had proved decisive in Tunisia. Call for fire drills, radio discipline, pre-registered artillery plans, and defensive obstacle design. The United States Army's processes for after-action learning, collection of data, candid analysis, dissemination of lessons, and incorporation into training become a practical pipeline for improvement. It is worth underscoring two institutional practices that accelerated the entire process. First, the theater-level authority vested in Eisenhower was an enabling condition. When he insisted on command changes and gave weight to operational directives, orders were implemented swiftly. Organizational inertia, which can turn a useful reform into a stalled memorandum, was bypassed by a commander with both the legitimacy and the will to enforce change. Second, American industrial capacity reduced the penalty for experimentation. Units did not have to hoard scarce radios or anti-tank guns. Replacements could be shipped, modifications made, and the risk of trying a new deployment diminished. Where a commander in another army might have hesitated because new radios or M10s were in short supply, American leaders could proceed because the logistical tail could, in many cases, sustain the experiment. Yet adaptation is not merely a matter of resources and orders. Organizational culture matters. At Kasserine, some leaders sought scapegoats for failure and explained defeats as the fault of individual units. At Guettar, the culture had shifted toward diagnostic inquiries. What in our systems failed and how can those systems be fixed? That attitude, questioning procedures rather than blaming soldiers, allowed practical solutions to be discovered and propagated. After-action reviews which ask what happened, why, and what will we change are hardly revolutionary. They are, however, rare in institutions under existential pressure. The U.S. Army in Tunisia found reasons to write and to act on the answers. The wider operational significance of Guettar and of the doctrinal changes demonstrated there is not merely a local tactical victory. In the weeks that follow, the lessons from Tunisia inform how American units approach Sicily and Italy. The same emphasis on pre-registrations, combined arms rehearsals, and the centralization of anti-tank assets shows up in planning for amphibious operations and in preparing defensive positions ashore. By the time American and British forces prepare for operations in the Italian mainland and later for cross-channel operations in Normandy, the habit of combined, rehearsed responses to armored threats and the rigorous use of artillery as an instrument of control has matured into doctrine. To be clear about scope and limits, the claim that American forces adapted faster than any other Allied army must be parsed. It is a comparative, theater-specific observation rather than an absolute judgment. The U.S. Army's tempo of adaptation in North Africa was exceptional because a cluster of favorable conditions coincided. Decisive theater authority, a willingness to remove and reassign leaders based on performance, the logistical ability to supply new equipment and radios, and an organizational willingness to convert after-action lessons into training. The British adapted in other ways, often drawing on long experience in desert warfare and logistical improvisation, and the Soviet Union adapted under catastrophic pressure on a vastly different scale. The Germans, meanwhile, adapted doctrinally, but by 1943 faced resource constraints and strategic commitments that reduced their capacity to respond everywhere at once. Within that comparative frame, the U.S. performance in Tunisia stands out for the velocity with which theory became practice. A succinct way to capture why the American adaptations were unusually rapid in that theater is to name the core factors, 5 pillars that, taken together, explain the acceleration. 1. Honest, institutionalized after-action assessment. Commanders and staffs were required to diagnose systemic failure rather than merely attribute results to chance or individual cowardice. 2. Theater-level authority exercised decisively. Eisenhower's capacity to remove, reassign, or empower commanders compressed bureaucratic timelines and made operational changes immediate. 3. Material and logistical capacity. American industry and logistics could supply equipment, radios, tank destroyers, artillery ammunition, fast enough that doctrinal experiments could be sustained. 4. Focused doctrinal correction and training. Doctrinal emphasis on massed artillery, centralized anti-tank reserves, and combined arms rehearsal was translated into practice through repeated drills and pre-registrations. 5. Leadership presence and enforcement. Commanders who insisted on standards, patrolled forward, and personally enforced procedures increased unit cohesion and the likelihood that complex, coordinated actions would be executed faithfully. These 5 factors are mutually reinforcing. Authority without capacity is impotent. Capacity without doctrinal clarity is wasteful. Training without leadership yields inconsistency. The American advantage in Tunisia was not a single fix, but the coexistence of multiple reinforcing mechanisms. It is the systemic combination, honest assessment, empowered command, material support, disciplined training, and visible leadership that created an unusually steep learning curve. What of the contested elements of doctrine, such as the tank destroyer concept itself? The M10 and earlier mobile anti-tank vehicles were products of a specific doctrinal debate. Should the Army create specialized mobile anti-tank formations, or should tanks themselves be the primary anti-armor instrument? Tunisia tested both ideas. In defensive set pieces where enemy armor could be funneled and engaged at range, centralized tank destroyer employment showed clear advantages. In other environments, the limits of the concept became apparent. The institutional lesson was pragmatic. Adopt what works in the theater, but continue to test assumptions. In the longer arc of military history, the tank destroyer experiment would be judged a mixed success. In Tunisia, it provided a timely and effective capability when employed under coordinated doctrine. Alliances, too, were part of the learning matrix. American reforms did not happen in isolation. Liaison with British units, the sharing of intelligence and local experience, and mutual tactical adaptations were constant. In some instances, interoperability frictions slowed implementation. In others, the British experience in desert logistics and artillery support proved invaluable. The American tempo of change did not negate Allied contributions. It rather exemplified how different strengths could be pooled when national forces were willing to adapt to a common problem. The moral dimension of the adaptation story should not be overlooked. There is a human cost behind every procedural bulletin and doctrinal correction. The urgency to change after Kasserine was driven by the knowledge that failure cost lives. The reforms were not academic exercises, but life-saving measures. That ethical pressure, seeing the consequences of systemic failure in blood and retreat, makes reforms more urgent and less optional. It also imposes a solemn responsibility on commanders and staffs to learn quickly, to codify truthfully, and to teach diligently. By the time the Tunisia campaign closes in May 1943, the cumulative effects of these adaptations are measurable. Axis forces in North Africa, stretched and outnumbered in men and material, are pushed into defensive collapses. The Allied operations in Sicily and later Italy benefit from the hard-won lessons of Tunisian fields. The specific methods, pre-registered artillery plans, FDC procedures, centralized anti-tank reserves, forward air liaison, do not always translate unchanged to every theater, but the habit of after-action learning that produced them becomes a permanent part of U.S. Army practice. Institutionally, the most durable legacy is not a particular vehicle or a single manual paragraph, but the development of processes that convert battlefield experience into doctrine. The chain is straightforward, if seldom easy: fight, observe, candidly, analyze, train, equip, and then fight again with the revised method. That loop, shortened and enforced by theater commanders and backed by industrial capacity, became a defining feature of how the United States Army operated for the rest of the war and informed post-war professional practices. There are caveats to that legacy. Not every adaptation in Tunisia was perfect or without negative consequences. Debates over the best use of armor and the eventual obsolescence of certain specialized concepts would continue. Moreover, speed of adaptation can mask other problems. Rapid change without sufficient testing can create new vulnerabilities. Yet the central empirical point, American units in Tunisia were able to convert failure into practical reform more quickly than many of their counterparts, is supported by the record of El Guettar and of the broader campaign when viewed in context and with appropriate qualifications. Finally, to return to the image that opened this narrative. The silhouettes on the ridge, those 50 tanks that rolled into the valley expecting to decide a battle, did not simply burn and vanish. They encountered an army that had been forced, by defeat, to look at itself and to change. El Guettar is memorable not because it delivered a single glorious charge that shattered the enemy, but because it turned doctrine into a disciplined, repeatable practice. The valley's smoke and the ringing of guns were the sensory evidence of a larger institutional transformation. Why did American forces adapt faster than any other Allied army in that theater? The answer is not pride or providence, it is procedure and structure. It is the combination of decisive theater authority, candid analysis of failure, the availability of material, the rapid conversion of lessons into training, and leadership that enforced standards under fire. Put differently, the Americans in Tunisia built a loop that converted experience into institutional memory faster than most of their counterparts, and they did it in time to matter. That is the lasting lesson of El Guettar and of the weeks that bridged humiliation and recovery.
When an army teaches its people to speak the same procedural language, when radios, maps, and rehearsals produce shared expectations, then adaptation ceases to be the lucky exception and becomes a reliable capacity. In the wide arc of the Second World War, that capacity mattered. It shaped how American formations fought in Sicily, Italy, and later on the beaches and bocage of Normandy. It left an imprint on doctrine, training, and the culture of an institution that would, in later years, make a professional commitment to after-action learning and combined arms practice. If this account has resonated with you, if the mechanics of adaptation, the human cost, and the architecture of institutional learning are part of the reason you watch military history, consider subscribing and joining the conversation. Share this with someone who appreciates the nuts and bolts of how armies learn, and tell us in the comments what element of adaptation you found most striking: leadership, doctrine, logistics, or training. At dawn on March 23, 1943, the valley at El Guettar did not produce a legend by accident. It produced a test, and the test proved a method. The Americans did not magically become masters of war overnight. They learned, built the organizational means to learn more quickly than many others, and then used those means again and again. That is why, in the cramped and urgent context of Tunisia, American forces adapted faster, and why those adaptations would echo far beyond one desert valley.